Hello, welcome you all again to the lecture series in political theory. You know, I am Professor H. Srikant. Today, I'll be talking to you about the reasons for the failure of the socialist experiment in the Soviet Union. Ever since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, one common question that I encounter in classrooms while teaching Marxist political theory is this: how could one explain the failure of the socialist experiment in Soviet Russia? The students ask, don't you think the fall of the Soviet Union or the restoration of capitalism in the so-called communist China prove that Marxism-Leninism is only a utopian ideology destined to fail? Such questions are natural and they need to be answered. So much is said and written about the causes for the demise of socialism in Russia and in China. Liberal scholars have attributed the failure of socialism to different kinds of factors: to overdeveloped nature of the socialist state, limits of dictatorship, resurgence of democracy, assertion of national identities, impracticability of socialist principles, vibrancy of capitalism, or Russia's what you can say adventurist involvement in the Afghan war, and so on. But how do Marxists react to the demise of socialist experiment? Do they admit that there is something inherently wrong in Marxism or Marxism-Leninism? Or do they attribute this failure to some other factors? True, immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many scholars, even in India, who earlier projected themselves as Marxists, became liberals or postmodernists overnight and started criticizing the so-called Marxist fallacies or utopia. However, I should also say that even after all that crisis, there are still many who continue to call themselves Marxist-Leninists. And they have also analyzed the factors. Many of these people do believe that the problem is not with Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, but it is with the practice of socialism in both Russia and China. What I am going to do in this lecture is to present to you the version of some radical Marxist-Leninist theoreticians who explained the demise of socialism in the Soviet Union by relating it to the growth of revisionism over a long period of time. In Marxist political discourse, we come across this term again and again, the term revisionism. Generally, this term revisionism is used as a kind of abusive word to refer to those who deviated from Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. There are many in Europe who criticized even Lenin as a revisionist. Interestingly, I have come across some works which argued that even Engels deviated from Marx, and all that he told about dialectics of nature has no base in Marxist understanding. These so-called scholars take everything that Marx said or wrote as revelations of God. How can devotees deviate from the path shown by the God? Such scholars only understood the words of Marx, not the spirit of Marxism. Marxist dialectics says that the truth is dynamic and it changes according to time and space. Marxism allows scope for development and updating of the ideas in the context of changing time and space. Thinkers like Engels, Lenin, Gramsci or Mao, they did not revise the fundamentals of Marxism. Rather, they have perfected and updated Marxism. Through their theory and practice, they showed how the proletariat can bring or proletariat sustain the revolution and move towards the communist goal. But I should say here that everyone cannot become a creative Marxist thinker. There are thinkers like Bernstein, Kautsky, Trotsky, Bukharin, etc. They were all Marxists at one point of time. But in course of time, for different reasons, they deviated from Marxism or Leninism, and their subsequent theories and practice, instead of strengthening the cause of the proletariat and paving the way for the onward march of socialism, they helped the enemies of the socialist revolution by creating confusions in the rank and file of the communist revolutionaries. Hence, Marxist-Leninists hold such theories and practitioners as revisionists. The criterion that distinguish creative Marxist thinkers from the revisionists is this: while the theory and practice of the former, that is creative Marxist thinkers, they guide and strengthen the proletarian revolution, whereas the revisionist theory and practice misguide and weaken the proletarian cause. Hence, Marxists, while upholding creativity, caution against revisionist tendencies within the party or from among the revolutionaries. During their own time, Marx and Engels waged ideological struggle against different socialist thinkers professing unscientific theories in the name of socialism. During his time, Lenin fought against revisionism of Bernstein and then Kautsky. After Lenin's demise, Stalin had to deal with the leftist adventurism of Trotsky and also the rightist deviations of leaders like Bukharin within the Communist Party of Soviet Union. It is not difficult to identify the class enemy. When for Marxists, identifying who is a class enemy, whether it is the capitalist class or the feudal lords or the comprador bourgeoisie or the imperialists, that is not going to be so difficult. But it is very difficult to identify and fight those who project themselves as socialists and friends of the working class, because they speak the language of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. So, correctly identifying, exposing, and fighting the revisionist tendencies within the party, both before and after the revolution, is considered as essential requirement for achieving and consolidating the proletarian revolution. Before we attempt to understand the reasons for the failure of a socialist experiment in Russia, let us know a bit about the achievements of the socialist Russia. After the socialist revolution of 1917, it took over 1.5 decades for the socialist state to suppress all internal and external enemies. The Soviet state seized the property of the exploiting classes, established socialist industries, and initiated cooperatives and afterwards collective forms in the field of agriculture. By providing free and compulsory education to all, the Soviet state created the human resources from among the proletariat and the peasantry to man administration, industry, agriculture, military establishment, and science and technology. In 1930s, the Soviet Union came out with a constitution of its own, guaranteeing free education and employment for all. during the Great Depression of 1930s, when the whole capitalist world was reeling under recession and unemployment, the Soviet Union was the only country in the world that could not only escape the recession but also achieved rapid industrialization and full employment during this period. Later, when the imperialist powers started fighting over the division of the world market and planning yet another world war to settle their differences, the Soviet Union wanted to keep itself out of the war politics, for entangling in the imperialist wars do not serve the cause of socialism. Stalin understood the dangers of the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, but other imperialist powers like Britain and the US were not interested to align with Soviet Russia. Hence, knowing very well the imperialist ambitions of Hitler, Russia entered into a treaty in 1939 to ward off the immediate attack on the Soviet Russia by Germany. But Stalin knew that the Hitler forces would ultimately attack Russia. Hence, Soviet Russia started making war preparations, taking advantage of the breathing space given by the Treaty of 1939. After the fascist forces occupied France and brought different East European countries under their control, Germany turned its eye towards Russia and attacked Russia in 1941. I'm not going into the details of what came to be known as the Great Patriotic War. How heroically and bravely the Soviet people fought the German forces for 2 years, and how they drove the German army back to Germany, liberating different East European countries on their way. Much is written about these things in several books. I should say, more than any country in the world, it was the people of the Soviet Union who sacrificed the most in the fight against Hitler's army and saved the world from fascism. The Soviet economy suffered immensely during this war. But under the leadership of Stalin, the Soviet Union reconstructed the economy in less than 10 years and emerged as a superpower, next only to the USA. The USA was the country which suffered least during the Second World War. Other more powerful capitalist countries of that time, the Great Britain and France, were shattered. So this heroic role played by the Soviet people inspired the anti-imperialist and socialist movements in different parts of the world. That Stalin died in 1953. At the time of his death, almost 1/3 of the world turned socialist. And it was feared that very soon many more countries would become socialist. It was for that reason that the USA came out with the NATO, SEATO, CENTO, and all these military alliances to stop or to corner the onward march of socialism. However, things did not go the way that the socialist countries anticipated, because after the death of Stalin, the leadership of the CPSU was taken over by one Nikita Khrushchev, who turned out to be a revisionist. Of course, immediately after the death, he kept mum for a couple of years. 3 years after he became the first secretary of the CPSU in the 20th Congress of Communist Party of Soviet Union, held in 1956, Khrushchev undertook the task of De-Stalinization, accusing Stalin of human rights violations during the period of collectivization in 1930s and afterwards during party purging on the eve of the Second World War. There is no doubt that some excesses did happen during the Stalin's regime. Since this lecture is not about Stalin, I will not speak today on achievements or limitations of Stalin. But here I only submit that revolution or civil war are not like playing chess in the boardroom, where physically no one dies. In real revolution or civil war, there will be so many twists and turns, and mistakes do happen. One needs to learn from these mistakes and address them so that they are not repeated again. But Khrushchev used the mistakes that happened during the Stalin's regime to denigrate even the positive contributions of Stalin. All that Stalin made to defend Leninism and to build Soviet Russia into a powerful socialist state. This de-Stalinization created confusions in the minds of Marxist and communist sympathizers all over the world, leading to splits in the international communist movements. Taking advantage of the anti-Stalin sentiments created after the 20th Congress of the CPSU, Khrushchev unleashed his revisionist agenda, which went against the very fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. Let us now discuss these revisionist formulations he made and the impact of the same on the Soviet state and society. We'll first discuss Khrushchev's revisionist theory of the state. Since you have listened to my lecture on Marxist theory of state, by now you know that according to Marxism, the state is always a class state. And this state comes into existence to protect and promote the interest of the dominant class. The Marxists always refuted the possibility of any state representing all classes of people. They consider even liberal state or the welfare state as versions of the capitalist state, and emphasize on the need to fight against the capitalist state and replace it with a proletarian state. They never claimed that this state established after the proletarian revolution will be a democratic state of all people. Rather, they stated that during the intermediary phase between capitalism and socialism, the state cannot be anything but the dictatorship of the proletariat. Revising this fundamental Marxist position, Khrushchev brought in the idea of a Soviet state as the state of all people. His argument was that since there were no capitalists or landlords in the Soviet Union, this Soviet state can be called the state of all people. This position hides the fact that although exploiting classes were not physically present in the Soviet society, their class ideas and class ideologies still exist in superstructure and continue to influence the people. Further, the absence of landlords and capitalists did not mean that there were no classes in the Soviet society. Alongside the proletariat, there are peasants, intellectuals, and petty bourgeoisie in the Soviet society. They may all be allies of the proletariat. Still, there are differences and contradictions even among them. As such, there are classes in the socialist society, and hence the proletarian state should continue to exist till the society reaches the stage of communism. But this Khrushchevite idea of the state of all people creates confusions and weakens the proletarian state by allowing non-proletarian classes to influence the state policies and programs. Now I come to the second deviation. His idea of a party as the party of all people. This is an extension of his own, his revisionist theory of the state, to argue that the Communist Party henceforth be the party of all classes. This is again a Marxist-Leninist thinking. Lenin felt the need for creating a revolutionary party of the proletariat to accomplish the task of a socialist revolution. It's a different matter that the party may align with other elite classes and lead them in the revolution against the capitalist class or the landlords. But the party should continue to be guided by proletarian interests and proletarian values. But by designating the party as the party of all people, Khrushchev opened the door of the CPSU for non-proletarian classes to enter and become members of the Communist Party, thus diluting the proletarian revolutionary consciousness, which is essential during the intermediary phase of dictatorship of the proletariat. The party ceases to be proletarian in character. When it ceases to be proletarian in character, it is bound to deviate from a revolutionary path. Now I come to his third deviation, his idea of peaceful coexistence. Marxists consider that the World War I or the World War II as the wars imposed by the greed of the imperialist powers to redivide the world market. As such, the proletariat and other masses have nothing to gain from these wars. Hence, Lenin withdrew from the First World War immediately after the Socialist Revolution. Likewise, Stalin also tried his best to keep the Soviet Union out of the Second World War. Notwithstanding their aversion to the imperialist wars, these Marxists did not shy away from war when they are forced to become part of the war. When they were compelled to become part of the imperialist wars, Lenin, Stalin, and even Mao made use of the contradictions within the imperialist powers in their own interest to advance the cause of socialism. As we know, the First World War facilitated the birth of Soviet Russia. And after the Second World War, 1/3 of the world became socialist. However, ignoring this Marxist position, Khrushchev got obsessed with nuclearization of the globe and the US threat of using nuclear bombs against its enemies. Scared by such threats, Khrushchev thought that if there is going to be another world war, the entire world would get destroyed. And hence he took the position that at no cost the Soviet Union or the socialist countries should do anything to provoke the imperialist powers to go in for wars, as they might culminate into another world war. So, in the name of world peace, Khrushchev advocated the theory of peaceful coexistence of both capitalist and socialist systems. He advocated that it is not through the words, but through competition, and by proving in practice the superiority of the socialist systems to address the problems of the people at large, that the socialist powers should attract other countries to opt for socialist paths. This stand is very much against the path that Lenin and Stalin took. Under their leadership, the Comintern lent support to the socialist and anti-imperialist movements across the globe. But after Khrushchev took over, succumbing to this nuclear blackmail, the Soviet Union virtually stopped supporting actively the anti-imperialist wars. And Mao Zedong described this approach of Khrushchev as appeasement of the imperialists. Mao maintained the position that the communists are against imperialist wars, but they are not scared of the wars. He made a distinction between imperialist wars and revolutionary wars. He declared that the imperialists were only paper tigers, and they would not dare to go in for another world war. He stated, if another world war is imposed, then that would be the last war for the imperialists. Mao argued that peace cannot be bought by begging for it. Rather, it has to be imposed. But this theory of Mao was too much for Khrushchev. He viewed Mao's position as adventurist and dangerous, and continued with the policy of peaceful coexistence, avoiding confrontation, direct confrontation with the West. Now I come to the fourth the deviation. His emphasis on economic incentives. You know, when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, Russia was still a backward capitalist country. It was considered as sick man of the Europe. Such an underdeveloped capitalist Russia, within a span of 35 years, under the leadership of Lenin and Stalin, emerged as a world power by 1950s. Despite the Civil War and then the Second World War, the Soviet Union effectively addressed the problems of hunger, poverty, illiteracy, health, and unemployment. All that became possible because of the emphasis that the socialist state has given to socialist industry, cooperatives, and collective farms, and then to education, science, and technology. The party and the state made efforts, and those efforts were complemented by the support of millions of workers and peasants. It is true that despite the progress that it made, the USSR, in the early 50s, was lagging behind the Western countries when it comes to consumer industry. All that good-looking cars, TVs, fridge, they were not available to the people in the Soviet Union. But all basic necessities were taken care of. Instead of looking at the achievements, Khrushchev became obsessed with the idea of increasing production and surpassing the achievements of the West. Now he wanted, socialism is a better system, so it should prove that it can deliver a better way of life compared to the capitalist countries. So to achieve this, he introduced the idea of providing economic incentives to the workers to work hard and produce more. At another level, he toyed with the idea of reverting back to individual farming to encourage agricultural production. Both these ideas were against communist ethics and socialist economic principles. See, the capitalists practice this deceptive idea of giving economic incentives to make the workers produce more, even while exploiting their surplus value. The socialist state need not resort to such cheap slogans, for it does not exploit the workers. It gives them what is due to them based on the work done by them or based on the value of their contribution to the society. Giving them more than what it is due, it amounts to corrupting them. It is going against the principle of each according to his work and each according to his ability. Same is the idea of revival of individual farming. Having grouped the peasants into cooperatives and then into collective forms. Now returning back to individual forming is a retrogressive idea that is bound to revive the private property mental complex. This is. Now I come to the fifth deviation. His idea of a peaceful transition to socialism through parliamentarian way. This is yet another departure from Marxism-Leninism. He came out with the thesis that because of the participation of the national bourgeoisie in anti-colonial movements in different colonies and semi-colonies, now they have become progressive, and hence in collaboration with this progressive national bourgeoisie, the workers and peasants in the newly liberated independent countries can pass over to socialism using parliamentarian paths. This strategy he proposed came to be known as a national democratic revolution. It assumes that there is a pro-socialist minded national bourgeoisie which will join hands with the peasants and the workers in fighting against the landlords and the monopoly capitalists and ensure peaceful transition to socialism in the third world countries. Khrushchev probably came to such conclusions seeing leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, who used to talk of socialism. You know, he even started public sector and initiated land reforms. But what Khrushchev ignored was that the same Nehru sent army to suppress Telangana peasant movement and prevented the Communist Party of India from forming government in Kerala, in the state of Kerala, in the mid-50s. True that the national bourgeoisie, which came to power in not only in India but also in the newly liberated countries, were not comfortable with the continued domination of the imperialist powers, and hence were opposed to imperialism in some ways. But at the same time, they were also scared of the workers and peasant rebellions in their own countries. Their talk of socialism was more strategic, meant more to appease the masses. And they didn't have the real desire to move towards socialism. Without understanding this dual character of the national bourgeois leaders in the developing countries, Khrushchev came to this un-Marxist theory of progressive national bourgeoisie and created confusions among the left parties, leading to splits in communist parties. In India also, the Communist Party of India got split over this issue. Today, what is called as CPI, today it advocates the same Khrushchevite path of national democratic revolution as the path towards socialism, though other parties differ with the CPI. These are the major deviations from Marxist-Leninist positions, and they had adverse effects on Russia and also the world at large. Khrushchev was in power from 1953 to 1967. His de-Stalinization measures were welcomed by all imperialist powers which dreaded Stalin. By spreading confusions about Stalin's regime, he took measures which went against the basic ideas proposed by Lenin himself. He created confusions in the entire international communist movement, leading to splits and the rise of narrow nationalist socialisms. Lack of united international front against imperialism gave a fresh lease of life to the imperialist forces. Although Khrushchev was replaced by Brezhnev after 1967, no sincere efforts were made by the CPSU to correct the mistakes done during his tenure. Though the socialist character of the Soviet Union did not change immediately, his rule sowed the seeds of revisionism. The negative effects of his revisionist theories and policies took full form subsequently during the Gorbachev's period, which actually facilitated the process or the completion of a counter-revolutionary process leading to the demise of socialism in the Soviet Union. More about it in my next lecture on Gorbachev's revisionism and the fall of the Soviet Union. I know that some of you may not accept this theoretical position. If you have different opinions or any doubts or need clarifications, you are free to write in the comment section. If you feel my lectures are interesting, useful, and provocative, please recommend this channel to like-minded friends. Ask them to subscribe to this channel and listen to my lectures. Thank you very much, and meet you again next week.